Driveze power driver is designed for use with hydraulic, air, gasoline-driven, or electric breakers. Shanks are available in sizes to fit the standard hex chucks: 7/8 by 3 1/4, 7/8 by 4 1/4, 1 inch by 4 1/4, 1 1/8 by 6, and 1 1/4 by 6. The shank has a tapered section that fits into the tapered hole in the body of the driver. When the tapered shank is driven into the body, it is a permanent connection. When ordering, please specify the shank required to fit the collet in the breaker to be used with the driver. Drivers are made for rod diameters of either 1/2, 5/8, or 3/4 of an inch. Specify the rod diameter for the chuck when ordering the driver. The chuck assembly for the driver uses chrome steel balls supported by a tapered ball holder operating inside the tapered opening of the body of the driver. The balls grip the rod for driving and allow the rod to slide through the chuck when the driver is being lifted up. Place the driver shank in the breaker and close the latch. Push the rod through the driver chuck until about 1 foot of the rod extends past the driver. The bottom of the chuck must be free to allow the ball holder to open so the rod can pass through. Lift the breaker to the vertical position. Push down on the breaker and start driving. When the bottom of the driver is at ground level, stop driving and raise the driver up the rod about 1 foot. Repeat this cycle until the top of the rod is at the top of the driver, and the bottom of the driver is at ground level. Driving on an angle is possible when rock or heavy material prevents driving a rod straight down. Maintain a pressure on the breaker to minimize the bouncing of the breaker on the driver. The driving rate will depend on the material being driven through. When the driver is at ground level, raise the driver on the rod. Repeat the procedure until the driver is at ground level and the top of the rod is at the top of the chuck housing. This prevents any distortion of the top of the rod. The threads on the rod, made for threaded couplings, can be used without damage to the threads. It is also important to protect the end of the rod from being distorted when using compression-type couplings or compression-type connectors. Remove the driver from the rod. Install the rod setting tool between the bottom of the chuck and the top of the rod. Drive until the large diameter of the rod setting tool is even with the surface of the ground. Remove the driver and the rod setting tool. The top of the rod is now 5 inches below ground. It is very important to keep the chuck assembly above ground. Driving the chuck assembly into the ground will force dirt between the rod and the ball holder and between the ball holder and the ball holder guide, resulting in the driver being stuck on the rod. The chuck can be released from the rod by pulling up on the driver and hammering down on the top of the rod using a piece of wood or a soft hammer. Do not enlarge the top of the rod to a diameter too large to pass through the ball holder. If the top of the rod is enlarged by hammering, cut off the top of the rod before pulling the rod through the chuck. The chuck can be cleaned by using a hose and water to wash the dirt out of the ball holder. The option to using a rod setting tool is to dig a hole deep enough to drive the chuck down until the top of the rod is below ground level without driving the bottom of the chuck into the dirt. This will require a hole about 15 inches deep. Short operators can use this method to keep their weight on the top of the breakers. When using the power driver, it is very important to keep down pressure on the breaker. Raise the breaker to a height that makes it possible to use your body weight on the breaker. Pushing down is much more effective than pulling down with your arms. The Driveze Power Ground Rod Driver can be used to drive through very hard material. It is important that the operator keep a down pressure on the breaker in order to obtain the best driving rate. The driver can be fitted with a shank for any breaker that has a standard hex collet. Here, the small air breaker achieves an acceptable driving rate even in very hard material. Larger breakers can be used to drive in harder materials and when multiple rods are installed with couplings. Longer strings of rods in the ground allow more vibration in the rod. A larger breaker will help overcome the resistance of the long string of rods when deep grounding is required. For more information on the use and maintenance of the Driveze Power Ground Rod Driver, call 1-800-448-2912.